The Dark, a prequel to the Dex Legacy audio drama series. Ren had always liked the dark, and after 2 weeks of fighting in the Domonos Mountains, he liked it even more. The daylight here was obnoxiously bright. Every time he stepped outside, his mechanical irises reached their internal shade limit, and he was forced to squint painfully. Dark glasses or goggles were a must, but even they had their drawbacks. The earth was brown and powdery, and so were the rocks. In battle, every hit threw clouds of thick dust into the air that choked and blinded and coated everything. Any eye protection constantly needed wiping, and visibility was poor most of the time. They'd taken to fighting in the early morning or at dusk to avoid the sun, which helped. Even if it put them on the same schedule as the Domonosi rebel factions they were meant to be subduing. That morning, they'd intercepted a supply train heading up into the caves where the rebels were based. He and his adopted siblings, Varian and Isra, had taken care of it on their own. There had been no need for anyone else. It was more heavily guarded than they thought it would be, but that hadn't been a problem. The Domonosi were more dangerous at a distance than they were up close. Their snipers were deadly, but their tactics relied on taking a shot and retreating, reappearing from a different tunnel and taking another shot. As soon as they were pinned down, their advantage disappeared. He, Varian and Isra had been adopted as babies from 3 different countries, genetically rebuilt from infancy and trained to kill. They had no problem taking the fight to the rebels. Isra stirred in the bunk next to him. He felt her naked skin on his own and stretched luxuriously. "How long have we been gone?" she murmured into his shoulder. "Almost an hour." She swore quietly and sat up. After returning to camp, they'd gone to shower the dust off themselves and got distracted before they could get dressed. It was becoming a habit that Ren had no intention of giving up. There was no light in the cabin except for the greenish glow from various electronic dials, and against one of these she was outlined in sharp relief. He ran a pale finger up her brown spine and she wriggled. Her back was crossed with scars of all shades, some old from childhood and some more recent. She stretched and her threaded shoulder muscles rippled pleasantly. "He's going to work it out," she said, swinging herself over him and gathering her clothes from around the transport cabin. Ren sat up. "Who, Varian?" "He knows us too well," she said uneasily. "But he's not expecting it," Ren pointed out. "Trust me, a week ago he was giving me advice on how to get girls." Isra pulled her sand-coloured military trousers over her brown legs. "Well, mission accomplished." "You're not girls." She straightened up, pulling her t-shirt over her head, and looked at him incredulously through the gloom. "I'm definitely a girl." "But you're not just girls. Random." She raised an eyebrow. "If this is going to carry on, we need to tell him." "Unless you don't want it to." Ren grinned. She wasn't going to get him with reverse psychology. "I want to carry on, I just don't want to tell him yet. Why are you in such a hurry?" Isra folded her arms. "He's our brother. We've never kept anything from him before." Ren honestly didn't have a response to that. He got up and pulled his trousers on. His legs looked ghostly pale in the greenish light. "We should tell him," Isra concluded. Ren groaned. "He's going to kill me." "He'll kill both of us," Isra said. "Or he'll try, but he's never been able to take us both down." "No, that's your speciality," Ren said, and she grinned. "It's not my fault you're both slow." "I'm serious, Isra. He's going to hate me for touching you. You're his sister." "And you're his brother," she said. "Have you ever thought about that? You're my little brother." "By 3 months," Ren interjected. "And he already thinks I'm a bad influence on you." He pulled his t-shirt over his head. "You are." She aimed a punch at his chest, which he blocked lazily. "Why aren't you taking this seriously?" Ren groaned and shrugged. "What if I died tomorrow? We're fighting a real war here, Isra. I don't want to spend my last day alive trying to explain this to Varian." "It's not a real war. It's subduing a rebel group on behalf of the Oscillian government." "A rebel group who occupy a range of mountains bigger than some countries," Ren corrected her. "Some would call that an invasion." Isra shrugged. "So we're invading." "And they're fighting back. Ask any of these Domonosi rebels and I'm pretty sure they'd say they're at war." Isra's eyes flashed through the gloom. "Why does it matter? Our orders are to subdue. We're out here with 50 soldiers each. That's only 153 soldiers total. That's not a war." "Even if that were true, you, me and Varian are worth how many soldiers?" Ren said. 50 each? 100? Isra shrugged. I don't know. A lot, I guess. Unless we die tomorrow. Unless we die tomorrow, Ren repeated. She leaned forward and kissed him, running her hand up around his neck and threading her fingers into the hair at the back of his head. Being with her felt right in every conceivable way. He'd just not worked out how to put that feeling into words. In the past few weeks, everything had changed between them. And as soon as Varian knew, it might all change again. Do you even know what you'd say to him? Ren asked. Isra shrugged. Not really. Okay, imagine I'm Varian, Ren said, sitting down on the edge of his bunk and making his knee jerk up and down like Varian's did when he was nervous about something. Tell me. Isra pulled a face. What do you mean? I mean, say what's going on between us in a way that won't make Varian want to punch either of us in the face. Go. She opened and closed her mouth a few times without saying anything. We're not related, she said finally. Not really. I know, Ren said. He'd been repeatedly finding his way around that question since it all started. Yes, they'd been raised together, but they were adopted and their home countries hadn't even been close. Isra was his sister. That hadn't changed, but they weren't related by blood. It was the one missing link that had made room for this. He'd always loved her, but for more than a year his feelings had been changing. Until a few weeks ago he thought it was just him, and he'd been half expecting to wake up from the dream ever since. Let's wait another week, he said. She slid onto his lap and he wrapped his arms around her, gazing into her bright blue eyes. The filament in her mechanical irises reflected the dim greenish light and glittered menacingly. His and Varian's were the same, an unforeseen side effect of some of the genetic treatments fed into them over the years. One round had triggered ocular albinism, blinding them for more than a year. Devek, the doctor in charge of their development, had created their irises to fix the problem, and it had worked. When they could see again, their eyes were the same icy blue, and for the first time they had a physical characteristic in common. Visually, everything else about them was different, even down to the colour of their skin. Varian was shorter than Ren by several inches now, with dark skin and thick black hair. He was strong as iron, with wide shoulders and thick arms. Isra's hair was also black, but smooth and sleek when it wasn't messy from battle. She would never be as strong as Varian, but she was quick and deadly and more than a match for him. Ren's white pale skin and blonde hair marked him as the odd one out. He was somewhere between Varian and Isra in speed, but longer in the legs, which he used whenever he could. They were so different, but had shared absolutely everything. What are we going to do? Isra asked quietly. No idea, Ren replied, grinning at her. Die tomorrow? She laughed and stood up. Come on, let's assume we'll survive and go and find our big brother. Ren rolled his eyes, grabbed his dark glasses and followed her out of the cabin. In the early afternoon, the light came from everywhere at once. The filter over his irises darkened as the mechanism whirred, trying to find a comfortable position. There was none. He put his glasses on and kicked at the dust irritably. The sooner they were done with this war, the better. Isra had already gone. She was skirting the camp and would spend 5 minutes with her unit before showing up at the transport they'd converted into mission control. Ren went straight there. It was well lit, but it felt comfortably dark compared to outside. Varian glanced up as he walked in. I heard from our father. Ren pulled a face. Why do you call him that? Because legally that's what he is, Varian said. The great and glorious Nathaniel Dex. We need to make faster progress. Our client's growing impatient. Their clients were the collected chancellors of Oskel, and Ren rolled his eyes. The Domonosi were never a threat before Oskel tried to force their ideals on them. Before that, there were a few small rebel communities scattered through the mountains. They only became a problem after Oskel tried to wipe them out. More joined their ranks to fight oppression. Now they're united against the one enemy and collected in strongholds. It's Oskel's fault, and it will take as long as it takes. Varian raised his eyebrows. I know that. But that's why Oskel hired the Dex military in the first place. Their own army caused this mess, and we're here to clean it up. Without their idiocy, we'd be back on the training quad or in the lab. And honestly, I'm glad we're here instead. Ren grinned and sat down. Agreed. We're away from Devek's experiments. We're in charge of our troops, and we're proving ourselves. Varian tapped a control panel on the table and a 3-dimensional map of the mountain appeared. You up for some more fun later? What kind of fun? The kind that means no more supply trains ever for our friends in the mountains. Ren nodded. Good idea. Tonight? Dusk, Varian replied as Isra walked in. The plan was simple. They would break the coils in the rail. The single rail along which the train ran was full of circuits that enabled electromagnetic propulsion. They had to get inside and dismantle the coils. It was dangerous. The line wrapped around the mountains, running high over ravines and sheer cliffs. They left the camp late, and by the time they were in position, it was almost dark. The Domonos Mountains may have been hell during the day, but they made up for it at night. Blazing sunsets melted like gold against the reddish-brown horizon, and almost immediately afterwards the sky would fade to black, streaked with inky purple where the spiral arm of the galaxy glowed overhead. The temperature plummeted quickly as soon as the first stars became visible, and Ren shuddered in the fresh chill on the air. They were about to cross a narrow support beam onto the rail, and he scanned the shadowy rocks across the ravine. Everywhere they went, he could feel eyes. They're watching, Isra said quietly. Who? Varian replied. The rebels. Varian snorted. They don't have our eyes, Isra. They can't see anything. Can't see anything of you, perhaps, Ren muttered. They were dressed in black for the operation, but Ren had worn long sleeves over his pale arms and wrapped a dark scarf over his white blonde hair. Varian and Isra didn't have it so bad. Ren glanced at Isra, who grinned back at him before turning to their brother. They're sure to be protecting this line, Varian, she murmured. Then stay quiet, Varian said irritably. Isra shook her head. We can't shine any lights or make any sparks, nothing that could mark a target. Wasn't planning on it anyway, Varian muttered. Ren shrugged and stepped out over the void. The sooner it was done, the sooner they could go home, and he could think of more than one way to get warm again. He set off northwards along the rail, aware of Isra and Varian following behind. A breeze whipped up from below. It brought hot, dusty air from the sun-warmed rocks in the ravine, and he only just managed not to cough. Sound carried in this place, and darkness amplified it. Like all senses came alive as soon as the glare of the sun stopped smothering them. A soft tap vibrated along the track, and he knew Varian had decided they should stop. Ren crouched down and reached past the lip of the rail to the smooth panels enclosing the mechanism. The edges were crusted with thick grime, and he followed one, moving crab-like along the narrow surface. There would be a vertical join somewhere with a latch. The panels were long, and he followed the rail as it curved gently around an outcrop. Eventually, he felt a corner and paused, running his finger down the join. He was completely absorbed in his task when another breeze stirred from below. He steadied himself to wait for it to pass. The last thing he wanted was for the panel to come away, get caught in the wind, and go clattering noisily into the depths. He glanced up and froze. Another face was staring back at him from a fissure in the rock he'd not even noticed. A male rebel face. They looked at each other in mutual shock for what seemed like an eternity. Then he moved and Ren straightened up. The rebel struck out with a long metal rod, and Ren dodged quickly. He didn't want to make a noise. If there was one here, there would be more, but there was a chance the rest hadn't been alerted. He dodged another strike, grabbed the end of the pole and pulled. The rebel lost his footing and let out a shriek as he fell into the darkness below. Ren let go of the pole, but he hadn't meant to. He shook his arm, which was rapidly going numb. The feeling seemed to be spreading, and he staggered back a few steps along the rail. Whatever that thing had done, it wasn't good, and he could feel the sensation creeping up his neck. He was about to turn when a shape fell from above, and everything went dark.